Put me in your will and I'll fix your legs. The words cut through the air, hanging there like a challenge Richard Denver had never imagined he'd face. They came from a child, a tiny 7-year-old girl, her soft voice stark against the clinking glasses and murmurs of an elite charity gala. At first, Richard didn't believe what he had just heard. He wasn't sure whether he'd misheard her or if she had said it for shock value. Maybe it was some sick joke, a game to toy with the wheelchair-bound billionaire. But the confidence in her voice, so calm, so sure, gnawed at him like a splinter lodged deep within his skin. Put me in your will and I'll fix your legs. Her eyes, locked onto his with unnerving focus, betrayed no playfulness, no hint of a child's whimsy. This wasn't a plea. This wasn't an offer. This was a declaration. A promise. Richard, paralyzed from the waist down, could only stare, frozen. His world of power, wealth, and influence had crumbled beneath him when the accident happened. His money couldn't fix him. His doctors couldn't fix him. No one had ever promised him anything close to the impossible healing he had once taken for granted. Could she? Could a little girl who had nothing to offer, nothing to gain, really offer him what everyone else had failed to do? The gala buzzed around him, oblivious to the gravity of the moment. His heart was pounding in his chest. The world went quiet in his ears. He couldn't look away from her. And for the first time since the accident, Richard felt something stirring deep within him. A flicker of hope. But could he believe her? Richard Denver sat in his grand office, looking out over the sparkling lights of the city. The panoramic view, once a symbol of everything he had accomplished, now felt like a cold reminder of everything he had lost. His empire, built over decades, seemed irrelevant now. His private jets, his penthouses, his millions, all served as nothing more than distractions from the unrelenting truth. He couldn't walk. He would never walk again. The sleek wheels of his wheelchair became the sole companion he knew, trapping him in his own body. The doctors had told him everything there was to know. There was no cure, no miracle, not even the most cutting-edge technology, the wealthiest resources, or the brightest minds in medicine could solve his fate. But Natasha? She was nothing like the people he'd met throughout his career. She was a child, barely old enough to understand the gravity of her words, and yet she approached him with the kind of resolve that only the truly desperate could fathom. Richard hadn't expected her to speak to him, let alone offer him something so impossible. And yet here she was, standing before him at a crowded gala, whispering a promise that sounded as insane as it did hauntingly plausible. Her words echoed in his head. Put me in your will, and I'll fix your legs. He had dismissed it as nothing more than the rambles of a child seeking attention. But as she walked away, disappearing into the sea of well-dressed strangers, something gnawed at him. His mind replayed her words. What if this wasn't just some whimsical fantasy? What if, just maybe, this girl had something he couldn't yet understand, that could offer him the one thing money couldn't buy? He found himself, despite every instinct, questioning everything. What if she was telling the truth? For days, Richard couldn't shake the thought. The question reverberated in his mind, louder with every passing moment. What if she could really do it? Could this child, so far removed from his world of power and wealth, hold the key to his freedom? The possibility seemed absurd, impossible. And yet, he couldn't let go of the seed she had planted in his mind. Was this his last chance? Was it his only chance? Or had he finally become so desperate that he was willing to believe in something, anything, that might restore his shattered life? What if she's telling the truth? It was a question that clawed at him in the quiet moments. The moments when he couldn't distract himself with business deals. The moments when he couldn't escape the prison of his own body. He had spent years building his empire, but now, The greatest challenge of his life was confronting the one thing no amount of money could fix. His mind, once sharp and unwavering, now wavered between skepticism and an unbearable hope. But was he just grasping at straws? Before this story unfolds, take a moment and ask yourself, what would you do if the world you thought you knew was turned upside down by a single act of kindness? Every choice in life has its consequences, and sometimes it only takes one moment to change everything. If you're ready to witness a story that will tug at your heart and challenge everything you believe, then subscribe now. Comment and tell us where in the world you are watching from. Don't miss the truth that's about to unfold. It could change you too.
Richard Denver had always been a man who believed in control. That's how he'd built his empire. That's how he conquered the world of business, technology, and finance. Every deal, every handshake, every power move, calculated. He had never once doubted his ability to shape his future. It was part of the reason he was so feared. He wasn't just rich, he was methodical, sharp, a predator in a world of prey. He'd come from nothing. A small-town kid who grew up in a crumbling house with a father who drank too much and a mother who worked herself to exhaustion just to keep food on the table. The odds had always been stacked against him, but he wasn't one to let anything or anyone define him. So he fought his way into college, fought his way into a prestigious internship, fought his way to the top, and when he got there, he didn't look back. The world bowed to Richard Denver. Every company he touched turned to gold. Investments flourished. His name was on the lips of every major CEO, his presence felt in every major city. It was all part of his plan. His desire to rise above everything that had tried to drag him down, to prove to everyone who doubted him that he was worth something. But all of that, everything he'd worked for, everything he'd built, had been shattered in a single moment. The accident. It happened on a rainy Tuesday evening, in the blink of an eye, when Richard had been in a hurry to close one last deal before the week's end. He was on the road, driving himself back from the meeting. The rain made the road slippery, the fog thick. A truck swerved. The crash was violent. The airbags deployed too late. The world spun. The pain was unimaginable, but it was nothing compared to the realization that followed. He couldn't move. In the days that followed, Richard was trapped, not just by his body, but by the reality of it all. He had spent his entire life accumulating power, wealth, influence. Yet it all meant nothing. His money couldn't fix him. His connections couldn't save him. The best doctors in the world told him the same thing. Nothing could be done. The damage was permanent. He was confined to a wheelchair. The thing he feared the most, that thing he had once thought was a weakness in others, had now become his own prison. Sometimes he wished he had allowed his driver take the wheels instead of himself, but he wanted to close that deal so quickly. He decided to drive himself, and now look at what happened. Many times he wished he did not make it out of that accident, to that this embarrassment would be avoided. But this had become his reality, every day. Richard didn't know how to exist in this new world. His empire, his legacy, seemed meaningless now. He couldn't even walk through his own office anymore without being reminded of his weakness. The doors that used to open for him now felt like walls. The high-rise windows that once offered him a panoramic view of the world now felt like a cage, keeping him from everything he'd worked for. The world outside moved on without him. His meetings, once full of the electric buzz of success, now felt like mockery. His business partners no longer looked at him the same way. He couldn't hide the reality of his condition. not even with the facade of power he wore. His sharp mind, his genius for negotiation, all seemed like they no longer mattered. He had tried everything: physical therapy, experimental treatments, meditation. But nothing worked. He was still in that chair, trapped, hopeless, desperate. It was at the lowest point of his despair, when Richard thought he had lost everything, that Natasha appeared. It was during a charity gala, the kind of event that was meant to bolster his image, to remind the world that despite his condition, he was still a player. But even that felt hollow. As he sat at the table, listening to the laughter of the crowd, the clinking of glasses, he couldn't help but feel invisible. That's when she walked up to him. A little girl, no older than 7. Her face was unmarked by the world, a soft innocence in her eyes, but her presence was undeniable. He had never expected a child to speak to him like this, especially not in a room full of people who fawned over him. But she did. "Put me in your will, and I'll fix your legs." Her voice cut through the air like a knife. Her words weren't playful. They weren't taunting. They were firm, certain, and Richard couldn't believe it. At first, he thought it was some cruel joke, a prank being played at his expense, maybe some twisted game to mock him, to remind him of the cruel twist of fate that had reduced him to this. But there was something in her eyes that stopped him, something that made him pause, made him question the reality of it all. She didn't want anything from him. No money, no recognition. Just the simple, impossible promise that she could fix him, heal him, return to him the one thing he could never regain: his mobility. Her words were like a challenge he had never expected to face. "Put me in your will, and I'll fix your legs." It was insane, ridiculous. A 7-year-old child couldn't possibly have the power to do what the greatest doctors and specialists in the world couldn't. Yet something about her, her confidence, her certainty, gnawed at him. It dug into his pride, into his desperation. What if she could? What if she was different from everyone else he'd ever met? What if, in some way he didn't yet understand, she could offer him what no one else could? For days after the gala, the words haunted him. It felt like a fleeting thought at first, then it became an obsession. What did she mean? Was it a trick? A joke? Or was there something to it? Could he dare believe in something as absurd as a child offering him the impossible? The question gnawed at him, louder and louder, until he couldn't ignore it any longer. For a man who had once prided himself on controlling everything, now Richard had nothing to control. Except one thing: the choice to believe. As he sat in his office, overlooking the city that had once symbolized everything he'd built, Richard realized the truth. He had spent his entire life surrounded by power, by money, by influence. But none of it mattered now. The only thing that mattered was the promise of a little girl who said she could fix what everyone else had deemed irreparable. And for the first time in years, Richard found himself at the mercy of a decision: to trust in the impossible, or to walk away from the only chance he might ever get to reclaim his life. The questions piled up, the doubt, the hope. But one thing was clear: nothing in his life had prepared him for this moment. Nothing had prepared him for Natasha, and maybe that was the point.
Richard Denver leaned back in his chair, the weight of Natasha's promise heavy on his chest. He hadn't believed in magic. He hadn't believed in miracles. But over the past few days, he had found himself drifting toward the possibility that maybe, just maybe, something extraordinary was possible. He had once believed that nothing could defeat him. He had been the man who built his own empire from nothing. He had worked his fingers to the bone, fought tooth and nail to reach the top. But when the accident happened, it took more than just his mobility. It took everything. It shattered his world, and with it, his belief in the fairness of the universe. No one had ever been able to offer him anything close to hope. Doctors had shaken their heads, therapists had given up, and even the cutting-edge technologies he had access to couldn't undo the damage. And then, there was Natasha, the girl who said she could fix him, the girl who offered the impossible. Richard thought back to the gala. He could still hear the echo of her voice in his ears. "Put me in your will, and I'll fix your legs." He wasn't sure whether he was ready to believe in her, but the thought of not believing in her made him feel more hopeless than ever. There was something about Natasha, something that wouldn't let him dismiss her as just another child. Richard was a man used to controlling everything. But now, he felt something he hadn't in years, powerless. And Natasha's words? They haunted him. Richard Denver leaned back in his chair, the panoramic view of the city sprawling beneath him, but his gaze was unfocused. The glittering skyline no longer held its usual allure. His mind, once sharp and decisive, now wandered aimlessly, drawn again and again to the words of a 7-year-old girl. "Put me in your will, and I'll fix your legs." The promise had been made with such startling certainty, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something about it was different. He had always been a man of control. Every facet of his life had been meticulously constructed, from the empire he'd built from the ground up to the wealth he had amassed. He'd bent the world to his will with determination and single-minded focus. The idea of something outside his control, something as bizarre as a child claiming she could heal him, was absurd. But for the first time in years, Richard felt the walls around him crack, and a creeping uncertainty took root. He was no longer the man who could conquer anything. A simple accident had taken that from him, leaving him a prisoner to his own body. The accident had shattered not just his legs, but his entire existence. All the money, all the power, all the success, none of it could return to him the one thing he wanted more than anything: the ability to walk. He hadn't believed in magic before. In fact, he'd laughed at those who did. But Natasha's words had stuck with him. There was something about the way she had looked at him, a quiet but intense confidence that defied her age. It made him pause, made him wonder, what if? The doctors had failed him. The therapists had given up. The treatments, the cutting-edge technologies, none of them had even made a dent in his paralysis. But then there was Natasha, this little girl who, in a room full of wealthy elites, had looked him in the eye and made an offer so absurd, so impossible, that it should have been dismissed outright. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was something to it. The thoughts were suffocating. Richard, who had always been decisive, found himself paralyzed not by his legs, but by the possibility that Natasha's promise could be real. Could she truly heal him? Or was it all just a child's fanciful imagination? "Put me in your will, and I'll fix your legs." The words echoed in his mind like a stubborn hum, getting louder with each passing day. He wasn't sure if he was desperate enough to believe her, but the thought of not believing was worse. The idea of rejecting the only sliver of hope he had felt in years felt like surrender. For a man who had once controlled every aspect of his life, it was terrifying to feel so powerless. Richard knew what he had to do. He had to find out if Natasha could really do what she claimed. But was he willing to risk everything on the improbable promise of a child? Could he afford to let go of his skepticism, to believe in something that made no logical sense? The answer, to even entertain the possibility, felt like the most dangerous gamble of his life. The next morning, as Richard sat in his study, staring absently at the newspaper in front of him, the phone rang. The sound broke through the fog in his mind like a sudden clap of thunder. He reached for the receiver, and the voice on the other end caught him off guard. "Mr. Denver," a woman's voice said, calm and unhurried. "This is Gloria Roberts, Natasha's mother." Richard sat up straighter, his mind instantly going back to that night at the gala. The memory of Natasha's confident whisper still fresh in his mind, he struggled to focus on the conversation. "Yes," he said, his voice slightly wary. "I wanted to follow up on Natasha's offer," Gloria continued, as if discussing a business deal. "She believes she can help you, and she's quite serious about it." Richard's heart skipped. "She believes she can help you." The words felt strange, as though they were meant for someone else, but something in Gloria's tone told him that she was neither joking nor dismissing her daughter's claim. Instead, there was a quiet confidence, much like Natasha's. Richard was taken aback. "I don't know what to make of it," he said, struggling to keep the skepticism from his voice. "What exactly does she want from me? And how can a child like her—" Gloria's voice cut through his doubts. "She wants to meet with you. In person. She has something she needs to show you, Mr. Denver. She's not asking for anything, at least nothing you're probably thinking, but she insists that you hear her out." Richard paused, unsure how to respond. This felt like the beginning of something he couldn't control. His instincts screamed at him to decline, to walk away from this absurdity, but the nagging pull of Natasha's words continued to haunt him. "Mr. Denver, I'm not asking for any promises and I won't pressure you," Gloria continued. "But Natasha has shown us both things no one else can explain. She doesn't need you to believe, but she does want a chance to show you what she can do." Richard sat silently for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. What did he have to lose? More time spent in the chair? Another round of failed treatments? Or was this his chance to finally escape the cage he'd been trapped in for so long? "All right," Richard said, the words escaping his lips before he had fully thought them through. "I'll meet with her." The decision was made, but it came with an immediate sense of unease. What was he doing? He was about to meet with a child who claimed she could do the impossible. He was no fool. He understood how ridiculous it sounded. And yet, what if? The meeting was scheduled for the next afternoon. Richard found himself obsessing over the details. Natasha's mother had given him an address, a modest apartment in a neighborhood he had never ventured into. It was a far cry from the opulence he was used to, and that alone made him uneasy. He was accustomed to power, wealth, and influence, but none of that had helped him walk again. He wondered what kind of person this Natasha's mother was. How had she raised a child so assured, so confident in something so outlandish? What had she seen in her daughter that Richard had missed? Could she really help him? He dressed slowly, his mind racing. The walls of his penthouse seemed to close in around him as he wondered if he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. When he arrived at the apartment, the outside was far less impressive than he had expected. A modest, almost humble building nestled among row houses. Richard's fingers tightened around the door handle, the moment of truth at hand. Gloria greeted him at the door. Her face was warm but guarded, and she didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Come in," she said. "Natasha's waiting." The apartment was small, cozy in a way that Richard couldn't relate to. There were no grand decorations or expensive furniture, but there was an undeniable comfort here, a sense of peace that felt foreign to him. As he was led into the living room, he saw Natasha sitting at a small table, her tiny hands folded neatly in front of her. She didn't look like a miracle worker. She looked like a normal child, too young to understand what she was offering, or so Richard thought. As he stood in the doorway, Natasha looked up at him. Her dark eyes met his with such intensity that for a moment he forgot to breathe. There was no fear in her gaze. There was no hesitation. She looked at him as though she had already seen him walk, as if it was already a foregone conclusion. "I'm glad you came, Mr. Denver," she said, her voice soft but sure. Richard's mouth went dry. He didn't know what to say. The room felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He could feel the weight of his skepticism pulling at him, but there was also something else. A flicker of hope, the faintest glimmer of something he had not felt in years. "Let's see what you can do," he said, his voice gruff, betraying none of the doubt that still churned in his chest. As he sat down across from Natasha, he couldn't shake the feeling that, for the first time in a long while, he was on the precipice of something that could change his life forever. The grand estate stood silent, its towering marble columns casting long shadows over the lush green lawns that sprawled beneath the fading light of the afternoon. Richard Denver's mansion, a reflection of his lifetime of achievements, felt suddenly cold. The walls, adorned with priceless artwork and trophies of his success, seemed hollow. In the quiet of his study, Richard tried to ignore the weight pressing against his chest. He had spent a lifetime commanding empires, breaking barriers, and controlling outcomes, but in the face of Natasha's promise, he felt as though he was standing on the edge of an abyss. "Put me in your will, and I'll fix your legs." The words had haunted him, gnawing at the edges of his mind. What if? What if this little girl could really do something no doctor, no surgeon, no technology could achieve? What if Natasha, the child from a completely different world, was the one who held the key to unlocking his freedom? A part of him knew it was absurd. A child making impossible promises. It was laughable, wasn't it? But then, another part of him, the part that had been buried under years of frustration and defeat, refused to ignore it. For the first time in years, Richard found himself wondering, what if? The invitation had come. The meeting was scheduled. It was time to face the impossible. But what was he expecting? What could he possibly hope for in a meeting like this? The thought alone was suffocating. Still, his curiosity, despite his reservations, had led him here. To this moment where the boundaries of reality and hope blurred, where the unexplainable became undeniable. As Richard waited, his fingers lightly tapping on the armrest of his wheelchair, the door to the study opened, and in walked Natasha, her small figure barely visible beneath the grand doorway. She was with her mother, Gloria Roberts, who followed closely behind, her quiet presence adding to the tension in the air. Richard's eyes locked onto Natasha, and his breath caught in his chest. She was just a child, 7 years old, barely past her 5th birthday, yet she held herself with a gravity beyond her years. There was a serene confidence in her steps, an unwavering composure that startled Richard. She moved with a purposeful calm, unbothered by the ornate surroundings. Gloria's face remained neutral, almost distant. She stepped back as Natasha approached, sitting at the small table in front of Richard. Natasha's eyes, dark, deep, and knowing, met his, and for the briefest moment Richard felt the weight of her gaze seep into him. It was as though she could see right through him. "Mr. Denver," Natasha said, her voice unhurried, yet somehow commanding. "I told you, didn't I? Put me in your will, and I'll make you walk again." The words dropped into the room like stones in a still pond, reverberating in Richard's ears. His body tensed, his grip tightening on the wheels of his chair. Her voice was soft, childlike, but there was no trace of uncertainty, no hint of fear. She spoke as though the promise was an undeniable truth, as though it had already happened. Richard's mind swirled. This was insane. This was a joke, wasn't it? He was a successful, self-made billionaire, a man who had seen and done it all. Yet here was this little girl, offering him a cure that not even the greatest minds in medicine had been able to deliver. But the calm, unwavering certainty in her eyes, the way she looked at him as if she already knew the outcome, unsettled him. It was impossible. He had to dismiss it. It was just a child's fantasy, nothing more. But what if? Richard's thoughts raced as he struggled to make sense of the emotions stirring within him. The last time he had felt anything close to hope was before the accident, before his life had been torn apart in an instant. He had given up on hope long ago, told himself that there was no place for it in a world defined by hard truths and cold facts. And yet, here was Natasha, a symbol of something he thought long extinct, the possibility of the impossible. "What do you mean, exactly?" Richard asked, his voice tight, betraying the mix of disbelief and frustration that churned within him. He hated the fact that he had to ask, that he was even entertaining this absurd idea. "I mean exactly what I said," Natasha replied, her voice unwavering. "Put me in your will, and I'll make you walk again." Richard's heart pounded in his chest, the words she spoke hanging heavy in the air. He had been to the best doctors, consulted specialists from all over the world, and spent millions in his desperate search for a cure. Every single one had failed. They'd told him the same thing, that his condition was irreversible. But Natasha, this child who had no wealth, no power, no influence, was offering him the one thing he wanted most in the world: his life back. Richard's mind was a battlefield. One side screamed in defiance, telling him that this was madness, that he was being foolish, that he needed to reject this and move on with his life. The other side, the side he had buried deep within himself, was whispering, "What if this is real? What if she can do it?" He stared at Natasha, trying to read her, trying to figure out if this was some cruel joke. But there was nothing in her expression that suggested she was playing games. She wasn't looking for money. She wasn't asking for anything. She was simply offering something that seemed impossible. And that, more than anything, was what left him shaken. Richard's eyes flickered over to Gloria, who stood silently in the background, watching the exchange with a quiet intensity. He could feel the unspoken weight of her presence, but it was Natasha who held his attention. He turned back to the young girl, his voice barely a whisper. "Why? Why me?" Natasha's expression softened, and she leaned slightly forward. "Because you need me, and I need you to believe." There was no hesitation in her words, no explanation, no justification, only a simple truth that left Richard breathless. A part of him wanted to push back, to argue that this was insane. But another part of him, the part that had long since been abandoned by hope, found itself yearning to believe. He looked down at his legs, the legs that had betrayed him, the legs that had once carried him to heights others could only dream of. What if this little girl could give them back to him? The question gnawed at him as he sat in silence, his mind whirling with uncertainty and disbelief. He had spent years, countless hours, working his way to the top, building an empire. And yet, now he was faced with the one thing that money couldn't fix, the one thing that no amount of power could conquer. Hope. "I don't understand," Richard finally said, his voice hoarse, the weight of the question pressing on him. "How can you do this? You're just a child." Natasha's gaze didn't waver. She simply smiled, a small, knowing smile, as if she understood something he didn't. "You'll understand soon enough, Mr. Denver." The room felt colder, the air heavier. Richard's pulse quickened, and for a brief moment he felt the stirrings of something inside him. It wasn't just hope. It was something deeper, something that both frightened and excited him in equal measure. Could Natasha truly offer him the impossible? As the seconds stretched on, the silence became unbearable. Richard's heart hammered in his chest. He wanted to believe, wanted to throw caution to the wind and place his trust in this child. But everything he knew told him to remain skeptical, to hold on to his control, to resist. Yet in that moment, in the quiet stillness of the room, something inside him shifted. The part of him that had fought for so long, that had pushed past every obstacle and never backed down, found itself questioning everything he had ever believed. What if Natasha was telling the truth? The air seemed to hum with tension. Natasha's calm assurance had infected him. He could feel the faintest stirrings of hope, like a flicker of light in the darkness. It was fleeting, but it was there. And for the first time in a long while, Richard wondered if it was enough. "I don't know what this is," Richard said quietly, his voice trembling with the weight of his decision. "But what if you're right? What if you really can do it?" Natasha smiled again, and this time, it wasn't a child's smile. It was the smile of someone who knew a secret. "You'll see soon enough, Mr. Denver. Just trust me." And in that moment, Richard realized that, despite all his years of control, he had just made a decision that would change everything. He had just placed his trust in a 7-year-old girl. Richard Denver sat in his study, the quiet hum of the estate's grand clock the only sound in the room. His eyes flickered across the expanse of marble floors and towering bookcases, as if seeking answers in the luxury that surrounded him. But answers didn't come easily these days. He had once been a man who controlled every aspect of his life. He had built his empire from the ground up, moved mountains, and wielded power like few others. But now, in the wake of Natasha's promise, the promise that haunted him, that refused to leave his mind, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: uncertainty. He wasn't sure why he had agreed to this meeting. He wasn't sure why, after everything that had happened to him, he was even willing to entertain the idea that a 7-year-old girl could cure his paralysis. But he had, and now, as the day drew closer, he found himself oddly compelled. It had started with a whisper, a simple but impossible promise. Natasha had spoken with such confidence, such quiet certainty, that Richard had felt a part of him stir. It wasn't the man who had built an empire from scratch. No, this was a man who had lived for decades within the walls of reason, logic, and cold facts. And yet, here he was, about to meet with a child who promised him the impossible. He wasn't ready. He wasn't even sure what he was expecting. But something in his gut, a primal instinct perhaps, told him that whatever Natasha was offering, it was different. It was something he couldn't ignore, something that, in the pit of his stomach, he wanted to believe. The sound of the doorbell rang through the mansion, jarring Richard from his thoughts. His hands tightened around the armrests of his chair. He had been expecting this moment, but now that it was here, he felt a surge of unease. His mind raced, his heart thrummed in his chest. This was a risk, one that could leave him more broken than before, or, and this was the most terrifying part, it could change everything. "Mr. Denver," the voice of his assistant broke through his reverie. "Ms. Roberts is here. She's ready to see you." "Send her in," Richard replied, his voice steadier than he felt. Seconds later, Natasha walked into the room, her small frame framed by the towering doorway. Behind her, her mother stood, watching quietly but closely, her presence adding weight to the moment. But it was Natasha who commanded Richard's attention. The little girl was calm, almost unnervingly so for someone of her age. There was a confidence in her that seemed to stretch far beyond her years, an assurance that sent a shiver down Richard's spine. Her dark eyes, filled with a depth that seemed out of place for a child, met his. The silence between them felt thick, and Richard could feel the weight of her gaze like an invisible hand on his chest. She didn't speak at first, but simply walked to the small table before him and sat, her mother standing silently behind her. Richard exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping nervously against the chair's armrests. He had seen her a few days ago at the gala, but now that she was here, the room felt different. This wasn't some charity event where she was just another face in the crowd. No, this was real. This was personal. And it terrified him. "Are you ready?" Natasha asked, her voice soft but resolute, like someone preparing to give a speech they'd been practicing for years. Richard blinked, surprised by the directness of her question. "Ready for what?" he replied, though he knew what she meant. "To see if I can fix you." Her words were simple, but they struck Richard like a cold gust of wind. A shiver ran through him, but he didn't flinch. He didn't allow himself to. He was a man who had faced impossible odds before. But nothing in his life had ever felt like this. The stark contrast between this little girl and the man he used to be, and the unimaginable promise she held in her hands. "Why are you doing this?" Richard asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Because you need me," Natasha replied, her voice unwavering. "And I need you to believe." Richard frowned, but said nothing. Instead, he watched as Natasha's small hands rested calmly on her lap. She looked at him, waiting. It was as though she knew what would happen next, as though she was guiding him into something greater than himself. After a long moment, Richard let out a breath and nodded. "All right, let's see what you can do." He had agreed, and now there was no turning back. Natasha's mother remained standing off to the side, silent but watchful. Richard couldn't help but feel her presence, as if she were the silent observer, while Natasha was the one who would make the change. The room was still. The silence stretched on. And then, Natasha moved. She stood up from her seat and walked toward Richard, her small hands brushing against the edges of the chair as she approached. Richard's heart began to pound in his chest, and his stomach twisted into knots. "This is crazy," he thought. "This is insane." But he said nothing. She placed her hands on his legs, lightly, almost reverently. Richard stiffened, the sensation of her tiny hands on his skin sending a strange current through him. He had grown used to the numbness in his legs, had come to accept it as a permanent fixture of his life. But now there was something different, something alive, the faintest prickling. Like the touch of 1,000 tiny pins danced up and down his legs. It was so subtle at first that Richard thought he might have imagined it. He blinked, unsure of what he was feeling. For the first time in years, he felt something he had almost forgotten, a sense of awareness. His breath caught in his throat. Was this real? "Do you feel that?" Natasha's voice was a whisper, but it cut through the haze of his thoughts. Richard didn't speak. He couldn't. Instead, he focused. He could feel it again. The faintest stir in his legs, a warmth that he hadn't felt in so long. A faint twitch. Impossible. The air around them seemed to thicken, the seconds stretching endlessly as Natasha's hands remained on his legs. Richard's pulse raced, his breath shallow. He wanted to speak, to ask her what was happening, but the words wouldn't come. The tingling intensified, not in an overwhelming rush, but in a slow, steady rhythm. It was like something deep within him was waking up, like his legs were remembering what it was like to move. Richard's mind screamed no, but his body betrayed him. He could feel it now, the sensation, subtle but undeniable, spreading through his legs. The numbness was receding, and in its place, something warm and strange began to spread. He could almost feel the weight of it in his bones, something that had been missing for so long. It was as if Natasha's touch was the key to unlocking a door he had thought was sealed forever. "Don't stop," Richard whispered, his voice hoarse. Natasha didn't speak, but her small hands stayed in place. The warmth in his legs grew, spreading like a fire along his spine, flickering with the faintest pulse of life. And then, for the first time in years, Richard felt something, a tremor, a shift in his muscles. A movement. It wasn't much. Just a flicker. Just a twitch of a toe. But it was there. It was real. The sensation faded just as quickly as it had come, leaving Richard breathless, stunned, and completely disoriented. He blinked, unsure of whether he had imagined it. He had to be dreaming. This was impossible. Yet his heart was still pounding in his chest, and the remnants of the feeling lingered in his legs. Natasha stepped back, looking at him with those deep, knowing eyes. She didn't smile. She didn't boast. She simply waited, watching him, as though she knew that what had just happened was enough to shift everything. Richard didn't know what to think. He wasn't sure whether he had experienced something real or if his mind had finally cracked under the weight of his desperation. But there was no denying the truth of it. The warmth, the movement, the sensation that had surged through him, it had been too real to ignore. Could it be that Natasha really held the key to the impossible? He didn't know. But for the first time in years, he felt a spark of something more than hopelessness. The experiment wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. Richard took a deep breath, his mind racing, his body still trembling with the aftershocks of what had just happened. There was more to this than he could understand, more to Natasha than he could yet comprehend. But there was one thing he knew for sure. The world he had lived in, the world of reason, of science, of logic, was no longer enough to explain what was happening to him. The impossible was now standing before him, and it was not something he could easily dismiss. "Let's keep going," he whispered, his voice trembling. And for the first time, in the quiet aftermath of the impossible, Richard believed. The days that followed Natasha's first touch were a blur of disbelief, hope, and uncertainty. Richard Denver spent the better part of each day reflecting on what had happened, yet he couldn't find the words to explain it. There had been something in her touch, something almost imperceptible, a warmth, a flicker of life that had surged through his paralyzed legs. A twitch. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him question everything he had believed. For years, he had lived in a world dictated by logic, power, and control. He had made his fortune through calculated risk, understanding every angle, every move. His body, once a force to be reckoned with, had failed him. A tragic accident had left him confined to a wheelchair, and despite his vast wealth, there was nothing, no doctor, no treatment, no miracle, that could reverse it. The doctors had all but given up, their attempts growing more desperate, but ultimately fruitless. Richard had accepted his fate, resigning himself to the fact that he would never walk again. And then there was Natasha. She was a mystery, a child with the audacity to promise the impossible. "Put me in your will, and I'll fix your legs," she had whispered to him at that gala. The words were absurd, the audacity almost insulting. And yet, in the days since their meeting, something had shifted inside him. Despite his skepticism, despite everything telling him to dismiss her as a child with an overactive imagination, he couldn't ignore what had happened in that room. The faint twitch in his legs, the heat that had spread up his spine. It was the first sign of life he had felt in years. It had to be a fluke. It couldn't be real. And yet, it was happening again. That evening, Richard sat in his study, his wheelchair pushed back slightly from the polished mahogany desk where he'd spent hours trying to focus on work. The skyline of the city stretched out before him, a glittering backdrop to his thoughts. He should be feeling grateful for his wealth, his empire. But all he could think about was the strange, lingering sensation in his legs. It had started small, like an itch under the skin, but it had intensified each time he focused. Each time Natasha came into his mind, every nerve in his body had long since dulled to numbness. But now, as he sat in his chair, the muscles in his legs seemed to stir in ways he couldn't comprehend. It wasn't a full-blown movement, nothing like he used to experience, but it was there, like a whisper from his own body, telling him it wasn't done yet. Richard rubbed his hands over his legs, trying to summon the feeling again. His fingers tingled against his skin, but there was nothing, just the cold, unyielding numbness that had become so familiar. He closed his eyes, trying to center himself. He had to think. There had to be a logical explanation, a reason for what he had felt. Natasha had promised him something impossible, something that defied every rule he knew. But that didn't mean it wasn't real. He couldn't just pretend it hadn't happened. It was absurd, yes, but so was the idea that a little girl could fix a broken body. And yet somehow it was becoming harder and harder to ignore. Richard let out a breath and reached for his phone. The screen lit up with a simple message from Natasha's mother. "Natasha wants to see you again. She says it's time for the next step." His stomach tightened at the thought. Natasha had been so calm during their first meeting, so composed. She had made her promise, and somehow he had believed her, or at least he'd allowed himself to. He didn't know why he was so willing to entertain this, but the thought of seeing her again stirred something deep inside him. Hope? Fear? He didn't know. But what if, just maybe, Natasha was right? What if she could really do it? He gripped the phone tighter, his thumb hovering over the call button. But before he could press it, there was a knock at the door. "Mr. Denver?" His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ms. Roberts and her mother are here." Richard's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't ready for this. He didn't know what to expect, what Natasha had planned, but he knew one thing for sure. Something was about to happen. When Natasha walked into the room, the air seemed to shift. She was smaller than most children her age, her hair tightly braided in a way that framed her face perfectly. Her eyes, dark and wide, seemed to see through him. There was no hesitation in her step as she approached, her mother close behind, watching silently. Natasha didn't speak right away. She just looked at him, her gaze steady, almost like she was measuring him. "You've been thinking about it," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. Richard swallowed, unsure of how to respond. There was no denying the pull of her presence. He nodded, though he wasn't sure whether he was agreeing to her statement or trying to find words for the way he felt. "I've been feeling something," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "Something in my legs." Natasha smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was calm, serene. "You've felt it before, but this time you'll feel it stronger. You have to trust me, Mr. Denver. You have to believe in the impossible." Richard's pulse quickened at the sound of those words. Believe in the impossible. How many times had he told himself that impossible things were just that? Impossible. How many times had he brushed off the impossible, convinced himself that the world operated within strict boundaries of reality? But now, Natasha was standing before him, a child who claimed to possess the power to change his life in ways that defied logic. And for the first time in years, Richard felt something else, a desperate yearning. A yearning to walk again, to be free from this prison of his own body. He nodded, swallowing hard. "All right, Natasha. What do I need to do?" She didn't respond at first. Instead, she took a step closer and gently placed her small hands on his legs. Richard stiffened, the touch unexpectedly warm against the coldness of his skin. He looked down, watching her tiny fingers rest on his legs, feeling the pulse of her touch as if it had a power all its own. "Close your eyes," Natasha said softly. Richard hesitated but did as she asked. The room was silent, save for the faint sound of his own breath. Natasha's hands remained still, but he could feel the tension in the air, the quiet hum of anticipation. It was almost as if she were drawing something from him, pulling the energy he had long ago lost. And then it came. At first, it was nothing more than a faint tingling, a subtle warmth. But it intensified, growing stronger with each passing second until Richard could feel it in his bones. It was as if something was slowly, methodically reawakening in his legs. He gasped, a rush of heat flooding his body. His eyes snapped open, and his breath caught in his throat. "Do you feel that?" Natasha's voice was a whisper now, the only sound in the room. "It's just the beginning. Your body remembers, Mr. Denver. It remembers what it's capable of. Richard didn't know what to say. The warmth spreading through his legs wasn't just physical. It was as if every muscle, every nerve that had once been dormant, was waking up, slowly, tentatively, but with a quiet certainty. He tried to move his foot. It twitched, just once. A tiny shift, like a spark of life flickering inside of him. And then, another twitch. His heart raced. He could feel it now. The impossible was unfolding before him. "I don't understand," Richard whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. I can feel it. I can feel my legs." Natasha didn't smile. She didn't say anything more. She simply let her hand stay in place, guiding him, letting the feeling grow stronger. Richard closed his eyes again, trying to focus, trying to harness whatever this was, whatever Natasha was doing. His legs were no longer just objects of pain and numbness. They were alive. He could feel them responding to him. For the first time in years, Richard felt hope. "I'm not sure what this is," he murmured, his voice cracking. "But it feels real." "It is real," Natasha replied softly. "You just have to trust it." And for the first time in a long time, Richard did. The sensation in Richard's legs was unlike anything he had ever felt before. It was as though an electric current was pulsing through his veins, waking up muscles that had long been dormant. For the first time in years, Richard could feel his legs, not as dead weight, but as alive. The faintest tremor of movement was all it took to awaken something in him that he had long buried. Hope. But with that hope came uncertainty. He found himself standing on the precipice, staring into the abyss of the impossible, unsure of what lay ahead. Natasha had promised him a miracle. She had given him a glimpse of something extraordinary. But could he trust her? Could he trust himself? He sat in his grand estate, the vast room around him seemingly closing in as the weight of the decision pressed down on him. The quiet hum of the house did little to soothe his frayed nerves. There had been no miracles in his life before, only hard work, endless hours, and the pain of watching his body deteriorate. "Is this really happening?" Richard wondered, his fingers tracing the armrests of his chair as he tried to steady his breathing. For years, the thought of walking again had seemed like a cruel joke. Now Natasha had given him more than a mere whisper of a chance. She had given him the possibility of reclaiming what he thought he had lost forever. But with that promise, the stakes were high. Natasha was offering him more than a physical transformation. This was a test of trust, a test of belief, a test of his very faith in the impossible. The morning after Natasha's visit, Richard found himself staring at his reflection in the mirror. His gaze fell to his legs, his mind racing with the events of the previous day. He had felt that flicker of life, that faint spark of hope, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at the edge of something monumental. It wasn't just about walking again. It was about believing again. Richard had spent so much of his life in control, of his business, his image, his world. He had built an empire on his ability to plan, to manage, to never waver in his resolve. But now, for the first time, he was being asked to surrender to something he couldn't understand. He had always been the one to call the shots, to make the decisions. Now, for the first time in years, he was at the mercy of something else. Someone else. The idea was terrifying. He tried to push it out of his mind. He had been told so many times before that nothing could be done, that his condition was permanent. But Natasha had given him something different, something real. And in his heart, Richard knew that this wasn't just about the possibility of walking again. This was about reclaiming his own faith. The faith he had lost the day his life had come crashing down. Later that day, as he sat in his study, pondering his decision, a knock at the door startled him. His pulse quickened. It was too soon for Natasha, wasn't it? But then he remembered the phone call, the promise that she would return. He had agreed to meet her again, though part of him had hoped she might wait longer. The idea of seeing her again brought an unfamiliar anxiety, a mixture of hope and dread that he couldn't seem to shake. "Come in," he called, his voice steadier than he felt. The door opened and Natasha entered, her small figure framed by the doorway. She was alone this time, her mother nowhere in sight. Richard watched as she stepped into the room, her gaze focused, her stride unwavering. Natasha was as composed as ever, her calm demeanor now almost unsettling. She didn't say a word at first, merely walked up to him, her eyes meeting his. Richard swallowed, feeling his heart beat a little faster. "Mr. Denver," she said softly, "you know what we need to do now." He nodded slowly, the uncertainty creeping back into his mind. Natasha had been right before. She had felt the spark of something within him. But now that the moment was upon him, the question loomed larger than ever. Could he trust her? Could he let himself believe that something this extraordinary was possible? "I don't know what's happening, Natasha," Richard admitted, his voice a mixture of awe and fear. "But I can feel it. I can feel my legs." Her eyes softened, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Good," she said. "Now you just have to trust me." Richard looked at her, unsure of how to proceed. Natasha had promised him a miracle, but what did that really mean? The doctors, the experts, they had all failed him. What made this child any different? He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe in this impossible thing, but his mind fought against it. "You're asking me to trust you completely," Richard said, his voice thick with doubt. "What if this isn't real? What if I'm just chasing something that isn't there?" "I'm not asking you to chase anything," Natasha replied. Her voice was quiet, yet firm. "I'm asking you to open your mind to what is, not what you think should be, not what you've been told." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. "I'm asking you to trust yourself." The room felt heavy with anticipation as Natasha moved closer, kneeling in front of him. She reached for his legs, her small hands warm against his cold skin. Richard tensed, not from discomfort but from a deep sense of vulnerability. This wasn't just about his legs anymore. This was about everything he had lost, everything he had fought for. Natasha's promise wasn't just about fixing his body, it was about restoring what he had thought was gone forever. She placed her hands gently on his legs, and for a moment, there was nothing. Richard's breath was shallow as he waited, unsure of what would come next. The quiet seemed to stretch on forever, the room holding its breath. Then, as if in response to some unspoken command, a warmth began to spread from Natasha's touch. It was subtle at first, like the flicker of a candle in a dark room, but then it intensified, like a current of electricity running through him, igniting his muscles, his nerves, his very being. Richard's heart raced as the warmth spread up his legs, moving through the tissue and the bones. For the first time in years, he felt something real. His mind spun, trying to make sense of it, trying to understand how this could be possible. But there was no explanation, no logical reason for the sensation that was pulsing through his body. The tingling grew stronger, more pronounced. Richard gripped the arms of his wheelchair, his fingers digging into the wood as he braced himself for whatever came next. "Do you feel it?" Natasha's voice was calm, almost soothing, but there was an undercurrent of excitement in her words. I feel it," Richard whispered, his voice shaky with disbelief. His legs twitched once, then twice. The sensation in his muscles deepened, a low hum that spread from his calves to his thighs. Could this really be happening? Was this truly the moment he had dreamed about for so long? The possibility of walking again felt like an impossible dream. And yet, in this moment, it was becoming something real. Then, without warning, The sensation abruptly stopped. Richard's heart sank as the warmth faded away, and with it, the movement in his legs. He couldn't believe it. He had felt it, the faint stirrings of life, only for it to vanish as quickly as it had come. His stomach twisted in frustration. Was it real? Natasha's hands remained on his legs, her eyes focused, unwavering. She didn't look disappointed. In fact, she seemed more certain than ever. "That was just the beginning," she said, her voice soft but unyielding. "Now we build on it." Richard exhaled slowly, his mind spinning with questions. There was so much more to this than he had ever expected. Was this really the beginning of something extraordinary? Could he really walk again? One thing was certain, Natasha was offering him something no one else ever had, the chance to believe in the impossible. And for the first time in a long time, Richard was ready to try. The silence in Richard's grand estate was suffocating. His mind raced, filled with a storm of doubts, fears, and a single, insistent thought. What if this is real? He had felt it before. That spark, that flicker of life in his legs. But it had been so brief, so fragile. Was he just imagining it? Or was there something more? His eyes were fixed on Natasha, whose small, determined figure stood across from him. She had told him that this would happen. She had told him that he could walk again. But what if I fail? The question hung in the air, unspoken but ever present. Richard had spent his entire life controlling every detail of his existence, from his business empire to his carefully curated persona. He was a man who made things happen. But here, now, in this moment, he was powerless. Natasha had made him feel hope in a way no doctor, no amount of money had ever done. She had given him the impossible. And now, the impossible was staring him in the face. "You're ready, Mr. Denver," Natasha said, her voice breaking through his turbulent thoughts. Richard nodded, swallowing hard as he pushed the fear and uncertainty aside. He had come too far to back down now. His legs, still stiff from years of atrophy, trembled slightly under the weight of his anticipation. He had been through so much already, the years of paralysis, the physical pain, the emotional toll, but nothing in his life had prepared him for this. Could he really walk again? Could he truly regain the one thing he had lost, the one thing that had once defined him as a man? Richard shifted his weight in the chair, his fingers clutching the arms of his wheelchair. Natasha had already shown him that something was possible, but he had never truly believed, not in magic, not in miracles. But as he sat there, gazing at the little girl who had promised him everything, he couldn't deny what he was feeling. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, spiritual. Something was shifting inside him, something deep and untouchable. "Do you trust me?" Natasha asked softly, her gaze unwavering. Richard looked at her. She was so small, so innocent, and yet she had a power, an understanding that seemed beyond her years. She wasn't asking for his belief in the impossible, she was asking for his belief in her. "I do," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. For a moment, Natasha smiled, the smallest glimmer of pride in her eyes. Then she stepped closer, her hands reaching out to place gently on his legs. The room seemed to hold its breath as she settled into position, her calm presence radiating a quiet strength. "Focus on your legs, Mr. Denver," Natasha said. "Let them remember what they've forgotten." Richard took a deep breath, letting it fill his chest, his lungs, his very soul. He could feel her hands on him, warm and steady, and in that moment, everything else faded. There was no estate, no wealth, no empire. There was only Natasha. There was only him. He could feel the same sensation he had before, the faint, flickering warmth. But this time, it was different. This time, it was stronger. This time, there was more than just a spark. There was a fire. His heart raced as he tried to push through the uncertainty, the skepticism. He focused, concentrating on the warmth spreading through his legs, willing his muscles to move, to respond. The air in the room seemed to thicken as the energy between them intensified, building with every passing second. And then, it happened. A tremor. A twitch. A shift that Richard could no longer deny. His legs moved. Not much, not far, but enough. Enough for him to feel something real. The sensation of life. The sensation of power returning where there had been none. His breath caught in his throat. "Natasha." But she didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply nodded, as if this was all she had expected. As if this moment had been written into the fabric of reality long before it arrived. And then, slowly, the impossible became real. Richard leaned forward, his hands gripping the arms of his wheelchair as the tremors in his legs became more pronounced. He felt them, his legs, come to life in a way he never thought possible. His muscles, weak from years of disuse, strained and stretched, but the movement was there. He could feel the ground beneath him, the solid earth that had been so distant for so long. His heart thundered in his chest as he pushed himself forward, his feet barely skimming the floor, but he was moving, slowly at first, then faster, and before he knew it, Richard Denver, the billionaire who had once seemed invincible, was standing. Standing. The weight of the moment hit him like a tidal wave, and for a split second, everything else in the world disappeared. The years of struggle, the pain, the isolation, they all melted away. In that single moment, Richard realized that Natasha had given him more than just the ability to walk. She had given him his life back. A tear slid down Richard's face, unbidden, as he gazed down at his legs. They were trembling, yes. They were weak. But they were working. And for the first time in years, Richard didn't feel like a prisoner to his own body. He felt free. Natasha watched him, her expression unchanged, but her eyes gleaming with quiet pride. She knew this moment was not just for him. It was for both of them. For Richard, it was redemption. For Natasha, it was a promise fulfilled. Richard's knees buckled slightly as he took another step, but this time, it wasn't from weakness. It was from overwhelming emotion. He was standing. He was walking. The impossible was no longer impossible. "I'm walking. I can walk," Richard whispered to himself, the words barely escaping his lips. The disbelief in his voice was still raw, but the joy, the wonder, was unmistakable. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. Natasha stepped forward, her hands lightly resting on his arms for balance. "You did it, Mr. Denver. You trusted me," she said simply. Richard's chest tightened as he met her gaze. She wasn't just a little girl anymore. She was something else. Something extraordinary. She had defied the odds and given him the one thing he thought he could never have again. "You've given me more than I could ever repay," Richard said, his voice full of emotion. "More than I could have ever dreamed." Natasha smiled up at him. A smile that held all the wisdom and grace of someone far older than her years. "You just had to believe," she replied. "And you did." Richard took a deep breath, his legs still trembling as he took another step forward. This time there was more stability, more control. He wasn't just walking anymore. He was living again. And as he stood there in his grand estate, with Natasha by his side, he realized that this was just the beginning. The beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where belief was no longer just an idea. It was a force that could change everything. For Richard Denver, the billionaire who had once built an empire with his hands, the greatest miracle wasn't the ability to walk again. It was the realization that he could still change, still grow, still learn. The road ahead would be long, but it would be his to walk. And Natasha, the girl who had shown him the impossible, would be there with him every step of the way. The transformation was just beginning. Richard Denver stood in front of the grand window of his estate, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of red and orange. The view was breathtaking. The city sprawled beneath him, a reminder of everything he had built. Yet as he gazed at the beauty that had once represented the pinnacle of his life, he couldn't help but feel a profound shift inside himself. The empire he had spent decades constructing, brick by brick, deal by deal, no longer held the same allure. His success, his wealth, all the things he had once believed would fill the emptiness in his life, now felt distant. The material things he had fought so hard for couldn't solve the one problem he had been grappling with, his inability to walk. But that had changed. And it wasn't just his legs that had healed. In the days since Natasha had worked her quiet, miraculous magic, Richard had found himself struggling to reconcile his past with the present. He was no longer the man he used to be. The arrogance that had once driven him, the desire for control that had defined every move he made, those qualities no longer felt like they belonged to him. In their place was something he had never truly understood until now: humility, hope, and a deep, unshakable sense of gratitude. "Mr. Denver, I've been waiting for you," Natasha's voice broke through his thoughts. Richard turned, his heart swelling as he saw her standing in the doorway. She was still the same small, quiet figure who had walked into his life with such confidence and certainty. Yet now, there was something different about her too. She wasn't just the girl who had healed his body. She had transformed his entire way of seeing the world. "Natasha," Richard greeted, his voice thick with emotion, "you've changed everything." She smiled up at him, her eyes soft but knowing. "No, Mr. Denver. You did that. You just had to believe." He couldn't deny it. She was right. The transformation had begun the moment he decided to trust her, to trust the impossible. The moment he allowed himself to believe in something bigger than his mind could comprehend. And now, standing here in front of him, Natasha had not only given him back his legs, but had restored something far more vital: his sense of purpose. Richard thought back to the man he had been so many years ago, the self-made billionaire with an unshakable belief in his own power. He had been a man who prided himself on overcoming any obstacle, someone who never took no for an answer. But then, the accident had come like a storm, wiping away everything. It had stolen his mobility, his freedom, and with it, his sense of self. He had been a prisoner in his own body for years, surrounded by wealth and luxury, but trapped within the confines of his wheelchair. Doctors had failed him, therapists had walked away, and technology, as advanced as it was, had offered no real solutions. He had lived in that prison, clinging to the faint hope that one day, maybe, he could escape. But deep down, he had known that hope was fleeting, that the world had turned its back on him. That is, until Natasha had come into his life. She was so small, so young. How could a child have the power to change everything? Yet she did. She had stepped into his world, a world so far removed from hers, and offered him a gift he had never imagined: the chance to walk again. And in doing so, she had given him something far more valuable, something that no amount of money, no number of business deals could ever buy. She had given him the chance to live fully again, to feel again. Richard turned from the window, his gaze falling on Natasha as she approached. She had brought with her a legacy far greater than anything he could have ever built on his own. And as he stood there, knowing that his life was forever changed, he realized that Natasha was no longer just the little girl who had healed him. She was a symbol of the impossible, of hope, and of redemption. She wasn't just a miracle worker. She was a reminder that, even in the darkest moments, something extraordinary could happen. That even when all seemed lost, there was still a chance for transformation. And for Richard, that was everything. "You've given me more than I could ever repay," he said softly, his voice laced with both awe and gratitude. "You've given me a second chance." Natasha's smile grew, but there was no pride in it, only quiet satisfaction. "It wasn't me, Mr. Denver. It was always in you. You just needed to find it." The weight of her words hit him hard. He had spent so many years searching for a cure, for something outside of himself to fix what had been broken. But in the end, it wasn't the doctors, the wealth, or the technology that had brought him back. It was his own belief. And Natasha had simply reminded him of that. The days following Natasha's miracle were a blur of emotions. Richard found himself waking up with a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. Every step he took, no matter how small, was a victory. He felt the weight of his body on his legs, the burn of his muscles as they adjusted to movement again. Each day, his confidence grew. Each day, he took another step into a future he had once believed was forever out of reach. And yet, as much as his body was healing, his heart was doing the same. The years of anger and bitterness, of feeling helpless and abandoned, were starting to fade. For the first time in so long, Richard was no longer isolated in his own mind. He was no longer a man trapped by his circumstances. He was free. Free to live, free to move forward, and free to create something new. "You're ready, Mr. Denver," Natasha said one afternoon as they sat together in the large, airy living room. The windows were open, the cool breeze flowing through, carrying with it the scent of fresh blooms from the garden. The sound of birds chirping was a comforting backdrop to their conversation. "I don't know if I'll ever be fully ready," Richard replied, his eyes meeting hers. "But I'm willing to try." "You already are," Natasha said with certainty. "The journey ahead isn't just about your legs, Mr. Denver. It's about everything else. The world isn't finished with you yet. Your life isn't over." Richard smiled. Her words were simple, but they carried a weight he couldn't ignore. Natasha was right. His story was just beginning. In the weeks that followed, Richard began to rebuild, not just his body, but his life. He returned to the business world, not as the billionaire he once was, but as a man with a new perspective. His relationships, once superficial, became deeper. He focused not just on making money, but on making an impact, on helping others the way Natasha had helped him. And through it all, Natasha remained by his side. She was no longer just a quiet presence in the background. She was his partner, his guide. Together they worked to spread the message of hope Natasha had given him, helping others who were struggling with their own battles, physical, emotional, or otherwise. Richard knew that the world would continue to test him. He knew there would be challenges ahead, just as there had always been. But now, he felt equipped to face them. Not because he was invincible, not because he was the same man he had been before, but because he had found something greater than wealth, power, or success. He had found the courage to believe in the impossible, and with that, he had found his true legacy. As Richard looked back on his journey, he realized that Natasha had given him more than just the ability to walk. She had given him a new way of living, a new way of seeing the world, a new way of being. And in doing so, she had shown him that miracles were real, not because they defied reason, but because they called us to believe in something beyond ourselves. And with that belief, anything was possible. What you just listened to isn't just a story. It's a reflection of life's most powerful moments, the ones we never see coming, the choices we make, the consequences that follow. But most of all, how one action can echo through everything. If you felt something deep within you, something that still lingers, subscribe now. Join us for more stories that aren't just meant to be told, but lived. Because the hardest truths are often the ones we're most afraid to face.